Now for Media Watch here on France 24, and for that I'm joined in the studio by our reporter James Creedon. Now James, the UN's climate summit is of course well underway in New York, and Greta Thunberg, that Swedish teenager, getting lots of attention on the internet.
That's right, a huge amount of reaction to her very emotional speech today in front of the UN and news organisations around the world, picking up the quotes with all of the emotion behind it if it's in video form, but also Thomas, just the words and the language. You can see here, "You have stolen my dreams and childhood." That was an Indian news channel tweeting that image, a visibly angry Greta Thunberg. You also had this quote, "This is all wrong. I shouldn't be up here. I should be in school on the other side of the ocean. Yet you come to us, young people, for hope. How dare you? You've stolen my dreams and my childhood." Now that very audacious sort of remark in video form there, generating a massive amount of reaction. Just to show you two reactions, some saying, "Good for her. She's the future. The world leaders are failing our children." But there were other reactions to that, saying that it was unhinged nonsense, except for the bit where, yes, she should be in school. I think those two comments sort of sum up a very polarised response to the person of Greta Thunberg, 16 years old. Some people just can't quite stomach the idea of a 16-year-old telling politicians what to do. Other juxtapositions that are coming through on social media are this image, which you've probably seen this on social media, Thomas, over the last 24, 48 hours. That goes back to 13 months ago when she was all on her lonesome on front of the Parliament in Stockholm. And of course, what we're seeing now is what a difference a year makes. A lot of courage and perseverance. Also, the juxtaposition of her on her own in front of the Parliament, and now all of the attention that she is sort of managing to gather around her person.
But some other comparisons are being made involving Greta Thunberg that are somewhat less flattering, so to speak.
Get a load of this particularly provocative comparison that's coming through on social media now. You would think, is that a troll who is actually coming out with remarks like that? Dinesh D'Souza is his name. He was an advisor to Ronald Reagan back in the day, a supporter of the Republican Party, huge following on social media. Children, notably Nordic white girls with braids, were often used in Nazi propaganda, an old Goebbels technique. I mean, obviously, it's an utterly despicable comparison to make, but it's to show you the extent to which Greta Thunberg has become a very polarising figure. And for a lot of supporters of Donald Trump, people just do not like this image, this 16-year-old audacious young woman coming up and making comments like that in front of the UN and the Congress and whatever. Others are saying she's worthy of a Nobel Prize, which would make her actually the youngest Nobel laureate since Malala. Perhaps in some respects a comparable figure, a young woman mobilising a lot of support around sensitive issues. But just to give you another perspective on this again, Dominique Schnapper, she's a sociologist and a philosopher. She was interviewed on France Culture radio here in France. Now, she would agree with a lot of the points that Greta Thunberg is making. She would also disagree with a lot of the strong critical language that is being used to condemn Greta Thunberg. But she says that she creates a feeling of malaise. She's sort of a strange person who is certainly being used, a strange personality rather, who is certainly being used, and you can't but conclude that she's quite a young person and surely couldn't know more than the experts at the IPCC. So that's, I suppose, somebody who agrees with the idea, but not necessarily with the form of the message in the person of Greta Thunberg. Some more remarks about her, Thomas. This is reacting this is a reaction that I was getting on social media to having shared some of the negative comments and seeing what comments would come back. She's a force in life politics and has succeeded in mass mobilisation of climate change awareness. It really doesn't matter how old she is or how much she knows or what she looks like, says Dr. James Slevin. Patrick O'Brien says, "I read something that if someone has nothing left to attack you on, they start going for your looks. Wise words. Greta's annoying all the right people." And just to kind of conclude on that, you don't let anyone tell you you're too young to sway people's hearts and minds. You can, you will, and you must, says Jana Spalding on Twitter, which reminded me of this cartoon, Thomas, that goes back to last year's climate summit, actually, and I think it's still as relevant now as ever. Using the French sort of French, il faudrait, il aurait fallu. It is necessary now, or before rather. It would be necessary during, and it would have been necessary, which is what we often hear all too often after the event, when it's too late. It would have been necessary to act now, basically. So I suppose a cartoon that points out the urgency that Greta Thunberg herself is managing to underscore, underline, emphasize.
And finally, you found some cartoons which have been picking up on the climate theme against the backdrop of the protests which were held here in the French capital this weekend.
That's right. Very busy weekend of protests in the French capital. There was the re-emergence of the Gilets jaunes on the Champs-Élysées. There was the climate march also in Paris that got infiltrated by some violent elements. And it was also a national day of heritage in France, which meant that a lot of buildings were opened up. So these are cartoons that play on the fact that heritage, global heritage, it was a weekend marking heritage in France against the backdrop of the climate summit. And you can see there people kind of saying, is that all that's left of a glacier? Is this kind of all that's going to be remaining of? And this one again, Journée du Patrimoine, or the National Heritage Day. Here is a real authentic piece of ice from the North Pole. In other words, is this how rare polar ice caps are going to be in terms of the ice that is rapidly melting in I suppose months, years ahead? I suppose a cartoon that draws attention to the urgency of climate issues nowadays.
Okay, James Creedon with Media Watch. Thanks very much.